Hey guys, brand new to this thread and most of Reddit in fact. I just posted a photo on Instagram with this story as my caption, and my friend told me to immediately post it here. It happened to me and my girlfriend on a hike just a couple of weeks ago in Washington. We shot this picture a couple of weeks ago, just before one of the scariest nights of our lives. My girlfriend and I had hiked a little over 3.5 miles down in the dark from this lookout completely alone. She had had a bad feeling about it from the beginning, and she really didn't want to hike down after sunset. About halfway down, in a portion of the trail so dense with trees that the moonlight couldn't even find its way through to the ground, we saw a light up ahead on the trail. As soon as we shined our lights in their direction, though, they immediately shut their lights off. As we approached from about 50 yards away, we started to get a very bad feeling, knowing someone was on this trail in the dark. Once we were within about 15 feet of where the light had come from, we couldn't find the person who had shined it in the first place. Instead, we saw a lone camper backpack just sitting upright on the ground, just off to the side of the trail. Already on red alert at this point, we began to scan the trees with our lights, asking aloud where the person was, knowing there had to be someone hiding nearby. As we sidestepped slowly down the trail, we finally saw him. He was a tall but small-bodied man, hunched over with a backpack on his back. His small stature was hidden behind the size of his backpack, and he was perfectly still in the pitch-black darkness. As we shined our lights on him, just a few feet away and seconds from freaking out, I called out to him, "Hey man, how you doing?" I prayed to God that the man was normal. No response, or even a glance in our direction. Instead, the man looked very angry. As he remained perfectly still, my girlfriend shined her light on the ground next to him to reveal a massive fucking axe. And before you even ask, no, it wasn't even close to a climbing axe. It was over 3 feet long and looked as if he had tagged a spike onto the opposite end of the blade. When he saw us looking down at it, he glanced up at me and slowly picked it up. He stood up from the ground and began to walk towards us. My girlfriend and I sprinted as fast as we could down the mountain, and for the next 30 minutes, we moved through the darkness in complete terror. We made it to our car, drove 45 minutes until we could get service, and reported it to 911. Still haven't heard anything back though. This story takes place 10 years ago, when I was just 16, and for almost that long I've wanted to tell it. I'm 25 now, and a female I should note. It surely won't be as terrifying as the best of the best, but I still think it's a strong contender. It's played on my mind ever since it happened, if that's anything to go by. I guess we'll find out now though. When I was in high school, I babysat on the odd occasion for a family I'd known since I was very young. They were great, really laid back. Honestly, it was the easiest babysitting job in the entire world, because the kids would usually already be in bed before I got there, and they always slept really well. It had been about a year since I'd babysat for them, and in that time they'd had a new baby, who was about 6 months old. So on this occasion, it was me, 3 kids downstairs, and 1 baby resting peacefully upstairs. I should really mention before anything that their house was completely amazing. It wasn't the flashiest or anything, but it was pretty huge. Although it was in a suburban street, it was positioned on a hill so that from the master bedroom upstairs, you could look out over the whole city. They also had tons of CDs, which back then was a really exciting thing. The kitchen was always full, and the whole place was decorated like a gallery. Amazing art, brilliantly designed and really spacious, that sort of thing. They always had interesting stuff around too. That night, I noticed in the front room amongst the kids' stuff, there was a fake samurai sword. I remember laughing at it, thinking it looked too real to just be a toy, and waving it around a bit. It didn't surprise me. They were interesting people, and I was always finding things that I liked whenever I visited them. The layout of the house was very cool too. The front door opened almost directly into the living room, and off to the side we had the 2 kids' bedrooms, then a staircase leading upstairs to the parents' room. The living room was fantastic, with giant windows overlooking the front garden and almost the entire street in front of it. The middle part of the house was completely open plan, with the kitchen and dining room spread out for what seemed like miles. Near the back of the house, they even had a small study, which was more like a little reading nook. From memory, it was just an armchair and 2 walls of books. That part is important, because the night this happened, that's where I just happened to be hanging out. I'd been dropped off by my parents at around 8:30, and the mom and dad left soon after, telling me the kids were fast asleep, and that if I had any problems with the baby, I could wake their eldest daughter who was good at settling him, and she would help me if I needed it. I was really comforted by that because I knew virtually nothing about babies. I didn't need to in the end though, because the kids slept fine. The most important thing is though, I felt safe, at ease. They told me they would be back at around 1 a.m. and to call them right away if I needed anything. I wasn't particularly worried. I'd done this routine countless times before, and even though it was a cold night with a harsh wind, I knew this house like the back of my hand. I knew the kids would sleep. I knew nothing would happen. I felt almost like it was my own home. I felt so safe, in fact, that when I had trouble locking the screen door after they'd gone, I didn't stress too much about it. I thought maybe it was jammed or something. I didn't have a key to the front door, and usually the screen door shut just fine. They lived in a good neighborhood though, and it didn't occur to me at the time that it was anything to worry about. I quickly forgot about it and went to the study to read after checking in on the kids occasionally. After that though, I lost track of time for a while. I didn't have a mobile phone when I was 16, and there was no clock within the reading nook. I was totally lost within a book, and before I knew it, a couple of hours had already gone by. But it wasn't realizing the time that woke me up from my reading stupor. It was nothing at all, and that's what was so frightening. I'd been deep in the book, and then all of a sudden I looked up and felt such a strong sense of dread. Suddenly everything seemed more quiet, but then I heard the wind. An unease and fear washed over me, so much so that I felt reluctant to move and look. I didn't understand. I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. I thought as I stared at the books on the walls that maybe I'd just been sitting there for too long. So I got up and slowly wandered into the kitchen with the intent of checking on the kids and then maybe watching some TV. The front living room was in darkness, and as I stepped into it on my way to the bedrooms, something stopped me dead in my tracks. Within the light of the kitchen illuminating me from behind, I stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of a man standing in the front garden. He didn't move, and I didn't either. I could see that he had shut the garden gate tight behind him, and from his position in the garden, it was clear he'd been walking towards the front door that was unlocked. I didn't know what to do. A million thoughts overwhelmed me. I had no weapon, and the door was open. I couldn't get to the kids downstairs and the baby upstairs at the same time. The man was huge, and I was small. I was lit up, and he was covered by darkness, dressed all in black. I've never seen anything more terrifying in my entire life. I knew if I didn't do something, he would come inside and get us. But then out of the corner of my eye, I spotted that fake samurai sword, and very slowly, bending down slightly but not taking my eyes off the figure in the garden, I picked it up and raised it in the air above my head. I don't know why. I couldn't think of anything else in the moment. After what seemed like an eternity, he looked at the sword, then turned and slowly walked towards the gate, opened it, and walked away down the street. It was only then that I saw the glint of something at his side, something he'd hidden in one hand as he'd stood there staring into the house. I stood there for a long time just watching him walk away. Then I ran to the front door and leaned against it, forcing it shut against an intruder that was no longer there. I was 16, and I know this is stupid, but I never called anyone. I stayed that way until the parents got home, and I never told them what happened. I never told anyone for a long time. I thought that everyone would just blame me and pile on me for putting the kids in danger, and then I managed to convince myself that it was nothing, and maybe I'd overreacted. The family today are fine and well, and nothing ever happened to them or their house after that night, but I've always been thankful for that moment of intense dread that just so happened to cause me to leave the study, because if I hadn't, I don't even let myself think how differently that night would have gone. So, for the man in the garden, I hope the fake sword was enough to scare you away from lurking outside people's houses in the night, and I hope we never meet again. This story takes place in 2005. I was only 12 years old at the time. My family wanted to take a vacation, and my mom and ex-stepdad decided it would be fun to take a cruise along the California coast with my 3 younger siblings and myself. As our ship made its way under the Golden Gate Bridge, my mom and I stood out on our balcony to see San Francisco and the wide ocean beyond us. On the balcony to the right of her, a teenage boy emerged, presumably to take in the same scenery that we were. My mom gave him a polite hello when they made awkward eye contact, and he struck up a conversation with her. I wasn't paying attention at first, but then I heard him ask my mom, "Do you have any sisters?" I saw him peer over at me, clearly taking interest. Me being a shy 12-year-old, I tried to hide from his gaze behind my mother's side. My mom joked that she had 2 sisters, but they were probably much too old for him. They exchanged some polite small talk after that, which I didn't pay any attention to, instead taking in the view of the sunset over San Francisco and the Pacific. We went about our separate ways for the evening. Over the next couple of days, though, we always seemed to be running into this boy and his family. My mother is an extremely friendly person, so she would always stop by to talk with them. His parents seemed nice enough. The boy would always look at me intensely. By that point in my life, I was still developing my first crushes on boys in my school. I sure as hell didn't know what to do with that kind of attention. I didn't even know what his fixation on me implied, just that it made me feel as if he was seeing right through me. I avoided his stares by staying near my siblings, almost out of an instinctive protectiveness. On the 5th day of our trip, my mom came in and said this boy wanted to meet and hang out with us. She said his name was Asher. I thought he was weird and didn't really want to, but I was always taught to give people the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps my discomfort was just me being judgmental, I thought. I reluctantly agreed, and eventually he was in our hotel room. My mom gave me this smile and raised her eyebrows as if she was playing matchmaker. Then she went into her room, which was connected to ours. Asher was very odd right off the bat, and immediately my siblings and I were extremely uncomfortable. We were watching Scary Godmother on Cartoon Network, and I awkwardly asked if he wanted to watch something else. He probably thought our cartoons were stupid after all. He said he didn't mind though, just as long as he got to talk to me. My oldest brother, who was 10 at the time, immediately picked up on my body language and what he had said, so he joined in on the conversation to help put me at ease. Asher had a bit of an accent. I couldn't tell if he was foreign or if it was a speech impediment. A lot of what he said I just couldn't quite pick up on. He would sometimes lean over to me and say something quietly that although I couldn't hear or understand, I could just tell from the tone that I wouldn't like it. We spent the next while making awkward small talk about school, and he told me his graduation was coming up next summer. I asked him a normal question, if he was graduating from junior high. No, he meant high school. He then revealed to me he would be turning 18 that December. Sirens immediately started going off in my head. He handed me a note he said he had written for me earlier. With my hand shaking, I opened the note that read, "I love you. You're hot." I guess my brother saw the note from over my shoulder and went over to my parents' room. He then came back in and said, "Hey, sorry to interrupt, but our parents said we have to go to dinner now, so you'll have to leave." Asher took that as his cue to go, but stopped to tell me that he loved me one more time before his exit. I gave him a shaky, okay. My brother went to make sure I was okay, and told me he had only pretended to go to our parents' room because he didn't want to get our mom in trouble with our ex-stepdad for inviting him. I know this logic seems weird, but please remember we were all very little kids. I was trembling and silent for a while. I didn't really understand what had happened. All I knew was that I felt violated and confused. We later told our mom what had happened, and she then looked extremely guilty. She had thought he was a lot younger, and that he had had good intentions as well. She had left us alone in that room because she thought it would be a good idea for me to meet friends closer to my age, and because I was stuck babysitting the others all the time. Turned out, for some dumb reason, my mother had given him our home phone number before he had hung out with us. I was livid, but I was too timid to speak up at the time. I somehow managed to avoid Asher for the rest of our trip, aside from on the loading docks on the final day. He waved goodbye and told me that he loved me and would call me every single day before leaving. He left before I could tell him not to. After that, he called almost every week for 4 months, leaving strange and cryptic messages on our answering machine. Every time we would manage to block his number, he would manage to call right away from a new one. I had accidentally picked up a couple of times not knowing it was him, and would immediately hang up, only for him to call 3 more times and leave these same strange messages. Finally, a year after we had met, he finally gave up and stopped calling. So, Asher from the cruise, I may be old enough for you now, but please let's not ever meet again, you creep. Before I start telling you my story, I'd like to put you in context and apologize for every English mistake I could possibly make, as English is not my native language. I'm a 24-year-old girl from Algeria, a country that suffered a lot from terrorism back in time in the 90s to 20s. The extremist religious people would force everyone to be like them. They would randomly kill women without scarves. They would decapitate people for no apparent reason. It was a real time of horror. I was 7 years old by then, and me, my parents, and my cousin who's my exact same age, were in our car on the way to the beach. This was highly risky by then. As we were on our way in the mountains, about 20 minutes away from our last destination, we came across 40 men dressed as special police officers, walking on both sides of the road. My cousin and I just waved at them from the car windows, innocently, as my parents anxiously told us to stay quiet. The first officer in line had just proceeded to ask my dad to park on the side of the road, when suddenly he was told by another officer to just let us go. So he did. Without telling a word, nor checking our papers, they just waved back at us. We arrived at the beach, spent the day there. It was empty, and we spent a beautiful day. I still remember the joy and lightness that we were in on our way home, until we arrived to a small village we had to cross before arriving in the city. What we saw really terrified us to this day. There was blood everywhere, bodies, heads put on spikes and hung on spotlights. There were kids, elders, women. It felt like dreaming, and suddenly falling into a nightmarish place. I remember my parents yelling at us not to look while driving extremely fast outside the village. The scene was really movie-like. I couldn't even cry. I had no clue what I had just witnessed. Once home, they reported on the local news that approximately 40 terrorists dressed as officers went down from their hiding spot in the mountains and killed more than 50 people. So yes, the men we met on the road were the killers, and they simply decided not to kill us? For some reason. I wonder what that was every night. You can simply find information about terrorism in Algeria on Google. There are no words to describe the horror we lived in, and I just hope that maybe writing it down would make me feel better, since I still see those images in my nightmares, like bad scenes from a very bad gore movie. So to those murderers, I hope you burn in hell, so we'll never meet again. And thank you for reading with me.